Oh, that's loud. Normally I can do without a microphone. I have a loud voice for many reasons. Thank you all for having me here. It was hard to come because we are in the final stretch of our public phase of Philadelphia Assembled, of which I will tell you a little bit later. So my mind is very much in a sort of organizational mode, and that makes it not always so easy to be reflective. And I have to admit that when I was trying to prepare for this, I was like, oh, transforming capital, what I'm going to talk to you about. But I think I'm going to talk to you about some of the ways that I've been thinking over the last years and show you some projects and then end with what I'm doing currently in Philadelphia, so that you have a preview in my first ideas around that project. But as we are here now, to me this is also a very emotional moment, and I wanted to start with that because the first time I came to San Francisco is like almost 15 years ago, was for a conference that was called Generosity Projects, from which later the book All We Want Is Free was published, that Ted Purves edited, and Ted Purves was also the first person who invited me to come and speak in an international context, and also the first one who sort of like paid attention to my work. And that's also why I want to dedicate today to him. I find that emotional, but I want to read a little bit of what I wrote in that time, 10 years ago, because it sort of like was my first reflection on thinking about generosity and about the gift and about like alternative forms of currencies, of capitals. And I wrote at that time, and I have to put on my glasses, first of all, I do not like the term generosity projects, as it is, in my opinion, biting its own tail. But to use generosity in the setup generosity projects seems to me even more problematic, as it implies that you can stage generosity or stage an act of generosity, and even do it as an artistic practice. One could question what the role of the artist is when creating such projects, and why there is such a need for them. In a recent conversation with writer Ronaldo Ladaga at the Wexner Center for the Arts about this topic, he pointed out to me that in America you could see an interesting parallel between the way in which society withdrew from a lot of areas of public life and the demand for projects which are dealing with public space and the new career opportunities that spring off from that for artists. And I quote here Maaike Engelen, it is very lucrative to call oneself an artist nowadays, and then just to go on doing what one wants to do, whatever it may be. Whether it's helping the homeless, preaching in public, or spading over vegetable gardens for the neighborhood. Anything goes and gets subsidies as long as it's called art and has a public. As the philosopher and poet Maaike Engelen puts in her article, Creative Urge on a Seal of Improvement. She continues, so maybe a criticism could be that the artist behaves as a missionary in pursuit of converts, and that she conceives of art as a possibility to mold this missionary urge. All very well, this longer for a push for a better world, where acting is the central point, not listening. The good must be realized, must be attained. The responsibility is ours. That's all very well, but it's by now obvious enough how much misery good intentions can cause. The point is, not everybody shares them. It remains a struggle, and it will. And I like to start with that because I wrote that 10 years ago, and Maaike Engelen wrote that critique about some of my first public projects, and questioning this desire to act and to work with the community in relation to maybe thinking of an act of listening. So some of those conversations and some of those questions which started more than 10 years ago are still informing my my work, and I've been searching for answers to some of these questions. And you will, when you hear me talking now, you will hear some of these things come back and some of the struggles that I still have with it, and that this struggle is very, very, very real. So to me, Let me go to the PowerPoint now. Imagination as a collective exercise of care, taking matters into our own hands. And I hope I'm not echoing too much. Should I? It's okay? Okay. To me, the investigative and explorative qualities of the art should serve a process in which we can learn collectively how to engage and act upon the world in order to renegotiate the conditions of our existence. At this moment, this volatile political climate has put our work into perspective and calls upon all of our training and practice to act and imagine as a collective body. How can we and how do we? So over the last 25 years, I'm still questioning how to work with my skills as an artist within the complexity of our cities and put myself to work in areas that are undergoing rapid change and are under huge pressure from the forces of globalization. Trying to assist processes that make these tensions visible and encourage people to become actors and agents in the process of visualizing the dynamics, complexities, and the diversity of our cities. A practice that at the base has a continuous learning about what it takes to collectively take responsibility for the places we live, to collectively try to imagine a possible future. Questioning how can we collectively reinvent the city more after our heart's desire? How can we turn our political and economic choices into concrete actions for change? And how can we move towards collective action despite our differences? Asking, how can places become public again? Platforms for meeting, discussion, and conflict. And how to work on self-organization, collective ownership, and new forms of sociality and solidarity. I see the city as one large field of interaction in which I work. The projects are dynamic, constantly in motion, and constantly being worked at and reshaped. It's a working towards new forms of organizations, new forms of community ownership. And today I will try to talk, like I said, about like a few different projects, and I imagine that some of you read about some of them apparently because they're part of the ARTE ÚTIL series, but also you got some imagery. So I will talk a little bit about Homebaked in Liverpool and a little bit about the Afrikaner co-op, but predominantly I will also talk about what I'm currently doing in Philadelphia. So you get a larger shape of the thing. So I'm not going into depth about all the things, but over the next 2 days we can maybe in some workshops go a little bit further into certain skill sets and tools that I developed in my practice. So like you get a larger overview now and then we can go in depth, or we can in Q&A already get there. I have the tendency, if I get excited, to start talking more and more and more, so stop me or interrupt me if you have an immediate question, and otherwise let's go from it. But I wanted to start with actually my public faculties, because for me they're very important. They are my sketchbook. As Mike very much alluded already, that this act of creating actions, of creating interventions, that's as part of projects is a big thing. And I noticed also while doing long-term projects like in Liverpool or in Rotterdam or now in Philadelphia, that it's very easy to get stuck in all kind of like negotiations, stuck in certain conflicts that seem very hard to resolve, stuck in some of the negotiation with some of the institutions you're working with, or just not being able to push something further. And for me, it also became very important to find a way to create a kind of like a workshop setting for myself in order to not try to create actions or interventions or try to shape a project, but actually practice that act of listening. And for me, I call them my public faculties. And they are actually very simple. They take place sorry. They're actually an opportunity for me to practice the art of conversation and also to listen into people. Public faculties are very simple. They take 4 days, 4 hours each. And it involves standing on a location where there's pressure in a city and speaking to whoever wants to engage in a conversation about the issue at hand. Public faculties is about practicing public conversations and way of relating. This process does not necessarily bring new answers or solutions to a problem, but it shows how we perform in public space together, how we risk ourselves in order to envision other possibility. What is important is the way people formulate their answers to the questions, how they bring themselves into the conversation and what they withhold. That silence is also very important. I learn about how people feel and relate to the conditions they live in and if they think they have any agency in the situation. And I think like maybe some of you ever tried that, been part of some kind of canvassing exercise. It is very, very difficult to try to engage with a person on the street without having necessarily a set of questions or a set of tasks to complete or even categories or questions to be answered. To engage with a person into a conversation about larger issues that are at hand and trying to keep that conversation longer than just a yes or a no answer. And also not a kind of like pre-selected audience, but just, you know, whoever feels like that wants to be in that conversation. And what for me is very important about them is that, and I always use this one as an example because it was the first one, the first days that I tried it, I was not very good at it. Nobody like sort of wanted to engage with me in a conversation because I tried to sort of like allude some concepts, some ideas. I talked about public space and the decline of public space and nobody wanted to take responsibility for public space and how can we care for public space, and I was all on my like sort of like high horse, if you could say, about public space. And so the people were thinking like, who is she? What does she want? Is this a performance? Does she want to speak to us? And I wasn't clear myself if it was a kind of a performance or if I really wanted to have that kind of a conversation. So I struggled with it. And I always said what was very important in that moment was this woman with the white hair who came up to me at some point after day one, where I'd just been walking 4 hours on that platform. And she basically asked me a very simple question. She said, "Are you okay, love?" And I thought like, that was profound, because no, I was not okay. I was not doing very well, you know. I was just struggling with trying to find a way to engage with people. And although in my daily work and in my daily projects, I have a direction, I know how to do it, I want to do it, but to just randomly engage, I felt like I was not very good at it. And she said also something, she said like, you know, I have time to spend with you, so if you want, I can, you know, talk to you and you can listen to me. And that was for me, like, I think an important one. And it sounds very simple and maybe trivial to say it like that, but these are these moments where I think for me it was important to say, okay, those faculties are really about not only exercising conversation, but they are actually exercising listening and the willingness to listen to people and engage with them over a period of time without maybe even sharing the same value systems. So, like I said, I have been doing faculties all over. I'm going to do my faculty number 13 at the moment. I do 2 a year because for me they are a very good tool set to just, you know, freely try some of the things I'm working on. And this one was one in Copenhagen where we talked about austerity measures, how to validate austerity measures. And we did that in the main shopping street of Copenhagen. Not a very popular subject to engage people in about minimum wage, about budget cuts in favor for like people in parts of Europe that might need it. Yes?
Do you know anything about the history of I'm sure you know about it, but could you talk about the history of
public forums? Because it kind of sounds like that's what you're trying to generate, is a public instigation of communication about important topics.
Yeah, I mean, like the whole, like say, idea of public faculty was actually born out of a conversation with a dear friend, when we talked about, like, sometimes, like, you know, like people ask you, like, do you relate to this person, or what do you think of your contemporaries, or who is your hero, you know, or an artist? And people quite often ask me what I think of Joseph Beuys, if I feel like relationship to Joseph Beuys. And that is always a very difficult question to me, because I actually not feel that much relationship to them, although I like some of his, like, sort of like works he did that have a more social political, had a more social political, like say, qualities to them. But a word that I particularly like very much was a word that's called Constructs for a Better World, or better known as the Blackboard series, where he was sitting in a gallery talking with people about, you know, what would be things that could be done for a better world, and he would write them out on blackboards, or like you have whiteboards here. And like in that conversation I said, like, what might be able to would do differently if I would do a project like that now is I would not do it in a gallery and not do it with a group of people that are pre-selected, but I would do it in public, in a place, and with whoever wants to join in, to just also say, like, okay, that might be a way to start like talking about that. But to me there are more practices in, if you can, Socratic dialogue if you want, or practices in trying to listen how people describe their daily conditions, if you have any agency in that. So they're not so much about a forum, it's not about trying to get like 10 people together to talk about a certain issue, but it's really trying to listen into how people describe their daily condition, and if they have agency in that. And quite often, I always say, faculties don't bring you anything new, you know, like quite often there are things that I hear over and over again about how people describe certain situations. But it's not about that those answers or those descriptions are new or not, but it's about the way that people describe it, and it's about like exactly how they specify, they see themselves in that situation, and if they feel they can act upon it. And for me, that is a very important thing. And it's also important to me to do that. So I really see it as a sketchbook, much more than as a public forum. Hope that answers your question.
I'm just curious if you have any particular way of, like, if you're recording any of what's coming in as it's coming in, or are you keeping it in your head? I know in the other picture there was something behind you. I didn't know if it was written. And also if you ever use or are interested in kind of like crowdsourcing information in other ways, or if it's very important to you that it's this direct, face-to-face, one-on-one kind of information gathering.
So in analog of the Constructs for a Better World, I do draw out the conversations in one way or a form. Like the first one you saw, I was almost literally drawing it out on a white wall, you know, like this. Here we were, you know, drawing things out on like signs. Sometimes, so that's a way of recording it, but I don't record it neither on audio or on video. It's very important because it's not about that. It's about, you know, keep engaging in these conversations. So, and I think like what I want to give you, and that's why I have my papers with me, because like I'm always very bad at memorizing quotes by heart. I don't know why, but I do. But there's an interesting book by Danielle Allen, and she wrote a book, in a book, Talking to Strangers, Anxiety of Citizenship. She says in that book, "Don't talk to strangers" is advice long given to children by parents of all classes and races. Today, it has blossomed into a fundamental precept of civic education, reflecting interracial distrust, personal and political alienation, and a profound suspicion of others. Allen writes that democracy originates in the subjective dimension of everyday life, or what she calls our habit of citizenship, the ways we often unconsciously regard and interact with fellow citizens. She looks at the ordinary, daily sacrifices citizens make to keep the democracy working. Furthermore, she asserts that this entire process relies on the desire to talk to strangers. And I just give you that quote because actually that act of what the woman did in the very beginning, that like, you know, are you okay? I have time to spend with you. I can engage with you, was a very important act. That was a true act of generosity and not a staged generosity project, if you want, in my opinion, you know. So for me, agency is about how we can act upon our desire to have a better life. How can we move towards a shared desire of how we would like to live? How do we act in order to better our life or situation, while also serving a collective understanding? These are questions that need to be addressed in every living environment, within the city as well as beyond. Lately, I talk a lot about training for the not yet, or pre-enacting the not yet. How do we train ourselves to work within a collective body towards a shared desire of how we live when we cannot identify that collective body yet? How do we pre-enact our learning into the future? This is a process of becoming, a balancing act between individual and collective needs. If we think of agency only as a collective undertaking, we have to look at the step of how two or more people become a collective. What is critical to this process of finding a common ground with another person is being able to let go of some of one's own subjectivity, to put one's subjectivity at risk, or to temporarily extend one's subjectivity in order to approach other kinds of agency and look at the space that is in between. It's a process of becoming, a balancing act between collective needs, between individual and collective needs. In that in-between, we risk our subjectivities, not only through discussing values, but also through embodying our values in physical space together. Important in this process is allowing for one's own ideas and its own ideas and ideals to be withheld, even if it's momentarily. And I think that is something that is sort of like quite important in some of the work that I'm doing. It's quite often in situations where territories are fractures, or where communities are displaced, or where there has been ruptures, or where people feel left out, or where people feel disenfranchised, or where people feel completely not acknowledged. So talking about, like, if we talk about alternative forms of organization or alternative forms of capital, if you want, like we always think about, okay, how can we become a group? How can we create a collective process or a community process? But what do you do that when territories are so fractured and people are so sort of frustrated that they don't even want to take part anymore? So there's even a step before. And I think like Homebaked in Liverpool has been an interesting exercise of a project that at this moment is, I think, in its 6th or 7th years. And I saw that yesterday the BBC, the One Show, put again an item out on Homebaked, like 4 years after it first came to Homebaked. And unfortunately, because I'm here, I don't have access to the BBC things, because otherwise I would have showed you the item about how the people at the moment are running the bakery and talking about it. I mean, I think that's something that is very interesting to see where it's now, but the journey has been a tremendous one. And also the journey has been one that was not known in the beginning. In the beginning when we started, there was not the idea to start a bakery. You know, that was not how it started. So in that sense, I think I like one of the ways that James Baldwin always said, like the idea of the journey is that it is a journey to something that you not know where you're going. So like this idea. So I'm not going to describe the whole of Liverpool because I can do that in an hour and a half as well, only. But one of the things that happened in Liverpool was that it was in the north of England, and in the north of England there was a government scheme that decided to actually demolish a whole area by writing out eminent domain, I think you call it here. In England we say compulsory purchase orders, to ask people, to force people to sell their house in order to demolish existing house in order to build a new. And a lot of people very actively participated in this process of what they called housing market renewal. And people always said the clue was in the name. It was housing market renewal, not housing community renewal. And I think that was a very important point to think about. And what people didn't know when they were thinking about their new houses, and people participated in all kinds of projects around, like, you know, what they wanted, like a garden in the front, or preferred parking, or what kind of like kitchen appliances they would like, and even what kind of color of the front doors and stuff. Nobody explained them that, like, when they would move into their new house, that the price of these houses were much higher than the existing housing. So to give you the math of that, like, most of those people that lived in these two up to downs owned their houses outright, like in family, for a long time in family things. So people were offered £60,000 for their house, and in order to buy the same size house back in the new scheme, they had to pay £90,000. So most of them had to take out a mortgage of £30,000. So housing market renewal meant something like mortgage renewal. And for a lot of people that was not possible because they were maybe unemployed, or they wouldn't have that kind of money, so they were forced out. So when Homebaked started, it started actually with the title 2 Up, 2 Down. That's the name of one of those houses. And it transformed over the years into Homebaked. So 2 Up, 2 Down Homebaked aimed to create a new model of people-centered, community-owned regeneration of Enfield. It wanted to offer a viable alternative to the stalled top-down initiatives that had left the area desolated, lacking in amenities or work opportunities, and without a social center. Homebaked proposed a small footprint that would combine affordable housing with social space, green space, and enterprise in collective community ownership, allowing people to take matters into their own hand regarding the future of their neighborhoods, such as lifting the demolition order on the bakery building. And I think with Homebaked, I think what was very important, that when it started as a project to start working with different groups in the community, or people that were still interested in working, but about how would an alternative to this large-scale development look like? How would a community-owned alternative model look like? So it started with workshops, and it started with talking about like, how would community ownership look like? What would community development look like? How would people really see an alternative to their situation? And basically, while we first met in like community centers, at some point this building closed, and this was the bakery, the Mitchell's Bakery, and they had a sign on their door saying, like, you know, we served you for 60 years, but we are not capable of staying on anymore. God bless you for your business. And we thought it was very important to start using that as a workspace. So for the project, it's also very important always that there is some kind of local base to work from. And that base we started to use for community workshops about like this alternative. But what happened when we were there is that mostly people came in the door and asked if we were selling bread. So people would say like, hey, do you still sell bread? Or do you have cakes? Or do you have anything? And then some of the people in our group were like, the next day they brought some home-baked muffins or cakes, whatever it was, in order for then when somebody knocked the door, somebody could have a cup of coffee and take a piece of cake. So this idea of the bakery becoming the bakery was actually born out of the fact, again, like with the woman, that somebody just basically decided to actually bring a cake back in order for all those people that were disappointed about the bakery being closed, having the possibility to have a cuppa and a piece of cake. But that sparked very much the desire to reopen the bakery again as a community-run and a community-owned business, and to sort of start providing food and other products in the community. So I think like in a lot of these discussions, we discussed what was needed, what form of self-organization, of microeconomy, or skills to take matters in our own hands, and we developed the Homebaked Community Land Trust with a cross-generational group of people that collectively own and operate a scheme. A community land trust, as you all know, is a non-profit community-led organization run on cooperative principle by volunteers, which develops housing and other issues for long-term community benefits. So that were the things we were talking about, like what if we could own like one of these blocks, and what could it mean if we could sort of like start a development scheme of our own. But while we were having those conversations, those discussions about reopening the bakery became more and more important. And while the whole block was still under imminent domain and in the clearance zone, people sort of like started to really talk about the way of starting and opening the business, despite it being despite it being under demolition. And I think what is important here to stretch in this case is that the bakery had a great symbolic importance for the project, because it was not only a local landmark which provided a literary and metaphorically shop window and offered an accessible base, but people, like I said, regularly dropped in to ask for a loaf or find out what the plans were. And the bakery also resonated at a more universal level. It resonated that bricks and bread, providing sustenance and shelter, are the two most basic things a community needs. The sight of a community taking ownership of buildings and creating their own bread is one of the reasons that the project started to create so much attention. So like I always say, like I'm very honest, and if somebody of Homebaked listens, hi Homebaked, because I rather have other people talk about Homebaked at the moment. Like I said, I'm not so involved, but I know that I, as an artist, at some point was like if this project turns into a cupcake business, I want to be found dead. You know, like I'm very honest about it, because I had these grand ideas about community land trust and cooperative models, and although I liked the idea of the bread and the baking and stuff like that, I not completely was like completely how I say it, like celebratory of it. But while the project was growing, I understand suddenly that it was a level of entry into the discussion about ownership and about a cooperative future that a lot of people could understand. So it leveled some of these like grandiose ideas about like alternative forms and alternative organization and alternative ways of capitals, and it brought it down to something very simple, like let's bake bread in this case. I think something else that happened with this project was, yeah.
Was there an original idea for what would be there? Or were you all just planning to sit there in that space? Or did you have another idea for something other than a bakery that would bring the community together?
No, the idea was really from the beginning to start trying to ideate what an alternative to that condition of all the streets and streets of border of houses, how an alternative would look like. What would be needed for an alternative form of organization or of like urban renewal, if you want. How would that look like? What would that be?
So it was just really a community organizing space, or reimagining space?
Yeah, it was a community imagining space, imagining an alternative future, imagining a different way of wanting to be together, imagining a form of agency and on how the community would like to see that area developed. So it worked with those things. Yeah.
I'm curious about the process of like how you entered into this situation. Was there a government, local government, or developers, or the community? Were you living there? And what were your relationships and discussions with the developers, if there were any at that time, and the local government?
I'm not going to finish in an hour. So in this case, my original invitation was by the Liverpool Biennial. Yes, so the Liverpool Biennial invited me to come and work in Liverpool in 2008 to work with them on a like more durational project in public space in the north of England. So this was the whole start of the project was through. Let's say through the Liverpool Biennial. And it's also interesting to see how that project through time also changed. itself, because like when the project started to advocate for like building affordable houses and asking for lifting the clearance on the bakery building, it became almost directly oppositional to the local council, which was a very big struggle. But also when the community wanted to start opening this cooperative bakery, that's a workers-owned cooperative, and started to work with that, like I think a lot of people started to ask, like, is this a community organizing project? What has the biennial still to do with a bakery? Like, I mean, these were questions that were definitely asked, and I always said, like, I remember that I at some point had to talk to the board about, let's say, the way that the Two Up to Down and by then Homebaked was developing, and also how long would a Liverpool biennial be engaged or be involved in a kind of process. And by then, because of the bakery and the way it was running, the bakery was already capable of getting their own funds and their own ways of development, and also, like, it is a business, and from the beginning it was for the people very important that it would be a viable business. So the business model of the bakery is also been very much part of the development of the whole project. So, but I remember advocating to the board that affordable housing is the battlefield of our time, and that a community owned and built house or initiative, affordable house, is a monument of its time. So, like, that affordable housing is a battlefield of our time. So, like, and that would be a monument. So to create those block of affordable houses, that would be a monumental exercise, and they were that's all right, you know, but not completely. They like the argumentation, but not completely. And I think that's also with this project, I think as a project which took 2 years of negotiation and stuff like that, like, I think where it ended was that it took off with the bakery, and that the bakery took off on its own. And like now, so much years later, they're actually going to build affordable housing. But it took a whole loop around for that. And I think one of the important moments in that was actually a Liverpool biennial that happened 4 years later, in which, I see you, yeah, in which the biennial then asked also, like, how can you bring this back to the biennial festival? Because besides the fact that the biennial has a festival every 2 years, they also do larger scale public commissions. So I have to say that like that. And what we basically then did was something that was called the Enfield Home Tour. So we make a performative tour in which people from the city center, from the biennial venue, were traveling through Enfield by a local guide, and on their way to the bakery, they would meet people on the street and in their housing, trying to advocate and explain why this journey was so important. So it was taking people on a journey through a landscape of demolishing, of devastation, of frustration, and a way in which a community tried to sort of like get to grips with that and try to create agency, and how the bakery had become a form of agency. So that was a very important one, and the Enfield Home Tours became super important because that was the moment that the project became political. That people really stood up and started to voice themselves by telling their story over and over again, and telling them story also in a way not only as like, this happens to me, but this is what I took from it, this is what I want from it, you know. So I think that was very important, yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about the community organizing that was already going on? Did you help give them form and shape? Were they already there? Because obviously there was some self-organization that was happening because the bakery was separate or already sort of forming, or you set it up to... I just want to know about what was already happening in the community and the kind of role that you played and how you interfaced with it and how you helped, I don't know, develop and spur and cultivate that agency that you're talking about from the individual to groups and collectives.
Like I said, in the case of, like, in this case, it started with having those conversations. Like, the community was really scattered. at that moment, and very much, a lot of people were already placed out, like a lot of houses were boarded up, there were people still left in ice, so there was not so much community organization happened at that moment. And what happened when we moved into that empty bakery, when we when we were working there, is that from that place and from that working, the desire for the bakery started, and from that the organizing started. So that's exactly what I said. So like almost through the back door of the bakery, or to the front door of the bakery, if you want, suddenly it suddenly had enough tangible things for people to feel that they wanted to organize and could organize around something that they could run with. And that was very, very important. So like from that, the start was made to open the bakery, even do test baking. From then, you know, another form of renovation was made to the building. There was always happy that it's baking on TV during the One Show. That's why I really want to see the latest episode of the One Show. So people were, you know, talking on the bakery, on television. The One Show is a very popular format on BBC, about, you know, that they wanted an oven in the heart of Enfield. So they did a crowdsourcing campaign about buying a professional oven. They went on TV, and all of that was during the Enfield Home Tools, where people were sort of like, it was creating momentum. So before that, the desire to reopen the bakery sparked these forms of organizing, and then with the public action or the public performance, like in telling the story, that sort of like moved things up. Like even the New York Times wrote like a corner bakery at the town's rebirth. So it was sort of the momentum in which all these things sort of started to push forward. And then we talk in 2012, we talk in 2017 now, so this is 5 years ago, and since then the bakery has been through a third round of renovations, and to buying more equipment and employing more people and training people to become bakers, because suddenly, you know, you can want to create skill-based shops in an area, but then you need to have bakers, so it's not so easy to find bakers. So like there's a training scheme in bakers now, and also like Homebaked is a very lively place on any day now. I mean, you can follow Homebaked Facebook, Homebaked Liverpool, and you can see all the fantastic things that are happening. But a lot of things that were important for Homebaked were like beside like sort of like getting a momentum, also with crowdsourcing around the oven. But also it being a workers-owned co-op. But part of it is also that it's a consumer-based co-op. So it was also asking people to be a supporter, local community, to actually come and buy local. So it started also, when it started growing, it started also to deal with larger social justice issues, such as like buy local, you know, make us our preferred supplier. And one of the things that has been very important for a home-baked business model, and that's why I said if I can talk alone about the alternative like capital in that project and how it works, but for today I felt like then I should show you business models and sales stacks and like stuff like that. But like one of the most important ones of this one is that the bakery is like opposite the Liverpool Football Club, and which is like, if you are into football, Liverpool Football Club, they're doing well at the moment, so it's good for business. But like the Liverpool Football Club was also part of some of the let's say the larger forces in the area, because they wanted to extend the stadium, and for a very long time they didn't know if they wanted to stay or wanted to go, and finally decided to extend the stadium to the other side. So they have been actually bleeding dry the high street, or they were instrumental in bleeding dry the high street. So they were also, like with the demolishing of the houses and the displacing of the community, there was also a business not knowing if it would stay or go. So like even the local high street didn't know where it was, you know, like sort of like, so the whole area was so like defragmented that it was very hard for anybody to make a living there or to do. So the bakery also worked against all odds, But what it did very effectively is that, and that's I think was in the part of the local organizer, that one of the bigger football supporter clubs, the Spirit of Jeanne, like a lot of those people are also part of the bakery. So they called upon the supporters club of Enfield to actually go and buy pies at Homebaked. So like Homebaked's main business model at the moment is selling pies, not bread, like Shankly pie and mushroom pie and this kind of thing. So it can provide like affordable bread to the community on the back of selling pies at match days. So like, just to give you an idea. Help. And like I just want to say, like that's their most preferable. And I just want to end with this one, and I'm not going to talk about Freehouse because I'm not even going to make Freehouse. I want to talk about, you have time? Okay. So to me this is an interesting image, and it's by one of made by one of the local community members called Fred Brown, and he also, and to me it symbolized very much, let's say, the struggle that's been going on, but that with something as simple as bread, it is possible to create also bricks. So, I mean, that was always the slogan of Homebaked, brick by brick, loaf by loaf, we will build ourselves. And that was also something like maybe in awkward English, but we build ourselves. By building ourselves, we also build ourselves and our relationships. And to give you, in the word of wise Fred Brown, as in all baking, so it also should be with developing an idea. Decide what it is what you want, gather materials, including people, do some frenzied work in preparation, then wait. Then do more frenzied activity, then wait again. Then apply the required heat. Taking the time it needs is a recognized and vital part of the baking process to produce the best result. So, taking time. In project development, it can be so frustrating as we wait on results. But it needs to be done. The time needs to be taken. Give it the time, give it the resources, and try not to prescribe. We nurture each other as though we rise. As though rises, we rise. And I think and I give you these people and these quotes and these stories because also here again, I think Fred, in his own profound way, exactly described what this kind of a collective process needs. It needs time, it needs resources, it needs people, but it needs heat and passion and that kind of thing. But it most of all, it needs the time to grow and rise as is needed. And that's quite often a sort of like very difficult balance in this kind of projects. And that's why I, like I said before, the faculties to me are important because like, as long as we call them a project, they seem to have a linearity. So, and I was lately at a conference and it was called, let's stop calling them social engaged projects, but let's call them acts of life, durational. So, and I think, like if we think about it like that, then in organizing them, it's like thinking like in a different way about time and about the linearity of time is very, very important. And this is maybe one of those goods that's one of those resources that is very, very scarce. Like the woman who said to me, okay, I have some time, to spend with you. So time to spend in order to grow and build, but also time to spend to go on that journey together and not prescribe like, oh yeah, and the outcome will be social housing, So that's why I honestly said, like when the whole thing with the baking came, and that really was like people bringing cupcakes and stuff like with pink and like nice things. I'm like, oh, So I also don't like baking, Personally, I have nothing with baking. So but I think it's not about that. So to me, it was about also accepting that on that journey, that seems to be the tool, if you want, or the toolkit that could move that project forward, and not only move the project forward in creating a fantastic bakery, which it is in providing job, but finally bring it forward to the point where it now can talk about an alternative development, about new houses to be built, about different shops to be built, about a true community-run initiative. That I am, like I said, I've not been in Enfield, unfortunately, for the last 2 years. I am following them on Facebook, I'm sometimes on the telephone or on the Skype, and I'm still on the board of the Land Trust. But I think like what Homebaked is now is like a totally new form of organization that from the start they have been building themselves. So but it needed preparation, it needed resources, it needed heat, it needed time. So it needed passion also, and believers. Like I always say, I'm a desperate believer. So in case people think that I'm preaching, sorry.
I watched a video, and there was a woman that had been there for her whole life. I think I saw her on one of the stands there. She mentioned that a number of families, this had been going on for a long time, that families had to move. And I'm wondering now that the bakery is realizing success and that some affordable housing is happening now. Are some of those families able to, are you in touch with, or are the people in touch with some of the families that had to move? Are they able to come back now, or is it new people coming in?
I think like for a long time the building of the master plan was stagnated. Like most of the new houses are built, so a lot of new people have been moving in, not necessarily some of the old people coming back. Like the building of the affordable housing still has to start, so it's not happened. So and that's also interesting in these projects. Like there's still a hard core group that's stayed around and that's still there, but there are also new people that came in that started to help picking this one up, and there are people that came back. So yeah.
I have a question. I'm sure you're going to get to this especially, and I'm especially interested if you speak about it in relationship to the American context in Philadelphia, but I'm curious, since you've been working in this space for so long, how the conversation around art and gentrification has changed, and how the ability of the people that you're working with to talk about it and talk about the ways in which art is a tool for opening up new ways of organizing, as you're saying, but it's also a way to shine a light, of the market on a space. And there's so many examples where art can go both ways at the same time in the same project. So I'm curious your thoughts on this divisive topic.
It was very hard to gentrify Enfield, I can tell you that. But I think, in the words of I think some of the people in Enfield, I think Sue just once said, it's not a big problem to her that the area gets better again, because that's why she works so hard. She wants this area to be a thriving area, an area that she remembers, and that she wants to be able to buy a loaf of bread, and that she wants to be able to go to a shop. So that where the area got decimated and became like a food desert and stuff like that, for the bakery to be a very thriving space and to be able to have a cup of tea there and stuff like that's very, very important, as long as she can still afford it. So and that's in Philadelphia, I'm working with a group, it's called the Women Community Revitalization Project, that have a coalition for affordable communities, as they call it, and one of their main slogans is development without displacement. So how can we think about developing areas without necessarily meaning that means displacing people? So I do think that is very, very important. I think that there is a difference, probably or not, like in this case for a community fighting for their livelihood and fighting for like a completely decimated area to become like livable again, versus like artists moving in and creating into affordable spaces and stuff like that. Like something like that does not yet happen in Anfield. But what does happen is that with the extension of the stadium, there's a new master plan made for the area. And a part of the master plan is to have a food court that is like more like, that is not just hot dogs and hamburgers, but that is a more like sort of like healthier food court in which they even think about having a local artisan bakery. And that's like that's like from here to there, you know. So like so what you do see is that some of this idea about having artisan bakeries or having certain things become very popular also when it comes to like urban renewal developments. So the bakery is in an interesting sort of like middle for that. But there's more of those questions because for like a very long time, for instance, the people, like for instance, the bakery sells like predominantly pies, that's where they live from, and they have like an affordable white loaf that they sell. Because for instance, for most people in the area, a sourdough is still too expensive. So like part of what the bakery has been doing is also to create an affordable white loaf. So it's like, I think with these kind of things is trying to create a balance, like say between the desire to create like this community place that deals with like sort of like well-being and good living, and keep it in one way affordable as well for the community, and how to balance those different things, and that are big questions. So like how can you develop an area of make things better without displacing people that live there? So like, and I think that we all as creative practitioners should be very, very aware of that, of like balancing, like in the way Mike already balancing our desires for you know, urban gardens, for healthy food and all of that, what we also need to think about, and affordability and the very difficult balance that is. So, yeah. Okay. No, Afrikaanwijk cooperative, I think. What do you think? What do people feel? If I talk about the Free House Afrikaanwijk co-op, then I keep talking and then you keep asking questions. And then I get to Philadelphia and then there's not so much time for Q&A, or I go to Philadelphia and there's more time for Q&A. Okay, good. Oh, yes. So, taking the time for things to grow is very important. And for that is like allowing for one's idea and ideals to be withheld, even if it's momentarily. And that letting go of one's subjectivity, practicing withholding in allowing for a collective body to form when there's no collective body yet. And that's especially important in a situation composed of non-homogeneous groups. How do you build a collective understanding of a territory when territories are fractured? How do you immerse yourself in something you don't know or feel alienated, such as a museum? That too requires taking risks. At the same time, there also needs to be a discussion about who is able and or cannot afford to take that risk. And I think that's something that is very important. I've been talking also about these projects. It's like if we say about that these processes take time, and that it is about becoming a collective body without knowing what the collective body is yet. If you are in territories that are fractured or that are not together, then the question is also like, how can we create time for people to become part of that and to take that risk of going on that journey and to be that. Now my whole talk is messed up, but it's okay. So in a recent article by the Spanish philosopher Marina Garcés, and that's something that I would recommend everybody to put on your reading list. It's very short and sweet. And the article is called Honesty with the Real. She talks about this process of risking your subjectivity as learning to listen, breaking something of yourself, to coach yourselves with new alliances. She writes about being affective, which in essence is to be sensitive to the way the other is in relation to you. What Garcés described is not just a mental exercise. It's an embodied experience of relationship. It requires a willingness to listen, not only to what the other has to say, but to become sensitive how somebody else is. We learn that by sharing notions of how we see ourselves, where we are in space and time. And this is an exercise that we're just beginning to learn. Most of us are bad at just allowing for things to emerge, because we are so ingrained in the neoliberal moment that we do not know how to withhold ourselves, how not to produce reactions or a surplus of objects and ideas. Withholding is not about becoming passive. In fact, it's very active, and it also can be very creative, because it's reassembling oneself in relation to others and through others. So this like putting heat, putting resources, wait, take time, wait, as Fred said, is very important. In that sense, it is important to think about the collective as a performative activity, to approach the notion of a collective not as a pre-existing social structure, but as actively becoming in context, so that becoming a collective is an acting towards, a coming together and dissolving and recomposing. I would like to talk now about Philadelphia Assembled as a sort of like way in which I have been thinking about like how to do the training for the not yet, as we say, yeah?
Sorry, I just wanted to get the name of
Marina Garcés. It's Honesty with the Real. It's in the readers? Yeah. It's a very interesting piece. Oh, yeah. Philadelphia Assembled is a project that has been unfolding since 2013. It has 3 public phases, 1 in the city and 1 in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And Philadelphia Assembled set out to reimagine the relationship of an encyclopedic institution to a changing city. And if somebody asks sometimes how this project starts and stuff like that, so like the Free House, which I'm not talked about, is actually a project that I kick-started, like the Liverpool project or Homebaked was a project that started, let's say, from the Liverpool Biennial, but then took on a life of its own and became independent. So like with a lot of like the projects I'm doing, I mean, I am very carefully before I engage with an organization or an institution on a project, but I'm also making very sure from the beginning that when a project starts growing, that institution and me are on a journey on that project, and that as soon as possible also like other people can enter that journey. And that means that quite often in all of my projects I'm also looking almost immediately for other sources of funding, other sources of income, other partnerships, because I think the terrains we're working on in our society is very, very complex. So I think this complexity should also be mirrored in projects. That means like with Homebaked, of course, at some point, if you want to keep the building and have that, let's say, the demolition order lifted from the building, at some point it is okay to be oppositional to the council, but you need the council for lifting that. So negotiating with the council at some point becomes a very important part for the group to do, to engage with that and to just say, okay, we need to find some way, a negotiation process between that. Like, and sometimes some of that can be helped or kick-started with money that is like maybe like more free, like you could say money from a certain organization or fund, but sometimes it's also good to tap into, for instance, money for affordable housing that's available, government grants, or in this case the bakery selling pies. So they're quite often also, like when they grow and become more sustainable, this project, they have a very complex mix of financing. And like I think you also have to always be very clear about how you work with that. So I think you're not only working with grants is preferable. Sometimes if you are like in a fight with the council, it's not very helpful to take council grants, you know, like it's not very helpful, you know. But at some other points there might be grants, from governmental grants, that can be helpful, or there might be organizations, but you have to question, I think, how and what and when money can be of help, or can help the project grow, or when it is almost counterproductive to the project. So like, and at the same time working on models for sustainability, and quite often thinking about, like in the Afrikanenwijk co-op in Rotterdam, we created a co-op on the scale of a neighborhood, like where we try to work with like the whole neighborhood in different, like in a network of cooperative structures, to organize most of the financial flows in the area, to make sure that the financial flows in the area are beneficial for the area. So like there are different ways and different models to think about that, but it's also depending on how and where you're at and where the moment in the process it is, what is most helpful for moving it forward. I think that's just an important extra. So I was asked by the Philadelphia Museum of Art, in this case by Carlos Basualdo, to think with them about, not only about maybe what's happening here with Tania, about like what would a exhibition of my work look like? And in this case, I think like it's not so much an exhibition of work, it's more like a re-evaluating some of my methodologies. So it's actually looking at what is the skill set that I'm operating. And that's sort of like an interesting, like sort of like in-between situation. So as I'm like working on this project, at the same time reflecting on some of these tools that are created or have been created. So Philadelphia Museum of Art is an encyclopedic institution like the Met, so that means they have contemporary collections, but also like Chinese and Asian collections and stuff like that. So Philadelphia Assembled set out to reimagine the relationship of an encyclopedic institution to a changing city. I started to think, what if a museum was treated more like a collection of atmospheres than objects, having the ability to send time and space to force relationships? What would be previously unconventional? These atmospheres would not just be confined to the gallery, but would permeate the entire institution, calling for a space that allows for different publics to enter, learn, participate, and grow. Philadelphia Assembled has 5 of those atmospheres that extend through the city and into the museum. These atmospheres were derived from over 300 conversations across the city, where I asked questions about the embodied spirit of a changing Philadelphia. At this time, I was exploring the city and its social, cultural, and emotional tissue, which I call the emotional substrata. That is what influenced our habitat much more than its physical appearance. I asked Philadelphians to introduce me to their neighbors, mothers, and colleagues. I asked questions such as, how can we shape the place we live? How can we find ways in which we want to live together within this incredible, rapidly changing world? How can we grip on the process of design, regulation, policy making, and how can people join or influence these processes? How can people have an equal say and take responsibility? And from those conversations, patterns of alternative forms of participation and negotiation in response to the political, social, economical, and emotional conditions of the city emerge. And I say it like that because I started these conversations almost like my public faculties. I just basically asked people that I knew outside of Philadelphia when I first came to Philadelphia in 2013 if they could introduce me to somebody in Philadelphia, preferably not in the arts or in any cultural institution. So I asked somebody like Sue Bell Yanks, and I know you have been reading an article she's been writing about the Afrikanenwijk cooperative and the birth of the Afrikanenwijk cooperative. As I knew that she was originally from Philadelphia, if she would like to introduce me to somebody. And she introduced me to her stepmom, who is working at one of the major hospitals, just to have a conversation about Philadelphia, where Philadelphia is. And I asked Ashraf Osman, somebody that helped me put together the Free House Closing Symposium, Radicalizing the Local, that I knew that I studied in Philadelphia. And he introduced me to all the people on his block. He was living like a few years back. So he had to go back and ask people like, hey, you know, I have this person coming, do you want to speak? And what was very important about these conversations in this case, that they were not in public space like with the public faculties, but they were in people's houses, in people's living spaces, in people's gardens, in people's community centers. And every time I had one of these conversations about like, you know, I was first talking about the spirit of Philadelphia, because I read this very amazing book, also one for your reading list, The Spirit of Philadelphia, about the way in which like the Bill of Rights for work, the Work Bill of Rights, actually written in Philadelphia, was a very interesting, still a very interesting document to think about instead of the Constitution. So to revisit that Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights for work. And I read that book when I was reading about conditions of work and this kind of thing. So I thought it was very interesting. And then it's also like, you know, I'm also always very honest like about like, and we can pick that one off, like when are you local and when are you not local, and how do you engage in the community or how do you not engage in the community. But, you know, so I was sort of like talking to people about Spirit of Philadelphia, and then everybody said, what do you mean, the party boat? Because apparently there was a big party boat that's called the Spirit of Philadelphia, which, you know, I was like, no, you know, that beautiful book about the conditions of labor? And everybody was like, for me, so now it's called Philadelphia Assemble. So, and for me, asking those questions about a changing landscape of a city, and you know, what are the acts of resilience and what are the acts of resistance, or how do people actually, you know, take matters into their own hands, and how do they get grip of their environment, how do they, you know, change their daily conditions, is very important for me. And this is for me very important. These political questions are central to how I learn about the city and embed myself in it. And they are also in reference to David Harvey's motto, the right of the city. Because what I like about his arguing about the right of the city is that Harvey argues that in order to build cities towards our heart's desire, we have to understand that this is not an individual desire, but a collective desire. And I think the conflict this question holds is an important one. How do we construct something according to our desire while transcending the individual and attaining the collective needs? In Harvey's thinking, one of the most neglected of our human rights is the right to develop our cities as a collective desire. And in my work, that is like sort of like very, very important. How do we do that? And how do we do that especially when, like I said before, territories are fractured and things are not homogeneous? So how are we working with it? So these often like challenging conversations that I had, and people passed me on from person to person to person, and I show you something that I've been doing the last 3 lectures. I'm showing you like some of my like way in which I sketch my work. I normally don't do that. I normally speak only about projects when they are over, not in the midst of it, because you will see that I'm struggling with it, because I'm still in it, so it's very hard to look back at it. So, but this was some of the diagrams of like people I met to keep track of, like just a mind map. But also I think like what happened In these often challenging conversations morphed into patterns of resilience, with stories of re-entry, coalition building, land sovereignty, and the creation of safe spaces. And these patterns of resilience grew into atmospheres that are now called reconstruction, sovereignty, future, sanctuary, and movement. And why I say that is that when I was having all these conversations about, like, you know, where is change happening in Philadelphia, I think conversations sort of like almost like word clouds, you know, like certain like understandings were popping up again. So people were talking about gentrification and displacement. Philadelphia is growing again, and like in the 3 years that I've been living there now, you know, you see the city changing in a vast speed. People were also talking about reparations, about the reconstruction area, about Jim Crow and post-Jim Crow, and like whose narratives are told and whose constitution is it, and you know, what are these things. People were talking about still a lot of the very empty land that Philadelphia had, and urban agriculture and black urban farms, and the need to reclaim that land, and the urgency of a land bank, but also the need for self-determination. Or people were referring to like what was now called sovereignty, like the way, what does freedom mean? What does unity mean? What does it mean to self-determine? And about like histories such as the one like the MOVE bombing, for those people who are aware of it, in Philadelphia, and how to work with that. People started to talk about safe spaces in the city, and also about Philadelphia being a sanctuary city. And this was before, like say, the Trump election, but also like how do we give safe space, and how can we provide different safe spaces for like maybe sometimes conflicting urgencies, and how does that work? So they became for me very much the leading principles of these atmospheres. My timeline of this project. Because when I talked before about like, you know, like time and how important time is it, and that you don't want to pre-inscribe a project and a project idea, and that you want to honor that journey, how do you then deal with time, especially also when there is a commissioner? So what I quite often do is I create sort of like containers that I think that I might need on the journey. So like a phase for preparation, and that's based on experience also, a phase for preparation, a possibility to do community organizing and to create moments and times and frameworks for community organizing, and to like allocate resources for that without knowing how to call them or how to call that workshop. So for instance, from the beginning, I dedicated a large portion of my time, but also of my budget, towards the possibility for people to meet and to resource that, to saying like, okay, we need the possibility for people to take part in this project. So that means providing stipends, providing travel expenses, providing childcare, providing a meal, so that it is a possibility for people to take part in this. But also trying to space out so the possibility for collective building and collective ideation. So this is almost like a score, like it's almost like an abstraction of like a sort of like possibility to do that. And up there is like sort of a diagram of like what's been happening. So what's been happening is that each of these atmospheres, they have an editor. I will talk a little bit about that, but each of the atmosphere has a working group that is comprised out of people from Philadelphia, some of the people that I met on the journey, some of the people that some of the editors brought along, and these atmospheres have been, working groups have been working the last 1.5 years together, like some of them monthly, sometimes bi-monthly, sometimes weekly, to basically try to ideate around their atmosphere, and to try to sort of like come up with a way to amplify the work done in the city through the lens of these atmospheres. So to just give you So what I did from the very beginning for this project, and I think that is very important, is that what I did is that I divided my artistic persona into an artistic team. And that was, for me, was very important, that when those atmospheres came into being and all this, like after all this conversation, it was for me very, very clear that I might not be also the most equipped one to hold certain of these conversations. And then, like, if we talk about that, it's like, how do you insert yourself in a certain situation? I think it's also very important to understand when you are the one that should lead the conversation or hold the conversation, or you should be just the one that helps the conversation to start, but is not the one who's holding the conversation. So I find it problematic when creative practitioner acts as the sole creator who are negotiating on behalf of others and use negotiation as a space of translation rather than as a true space of presenting, confronting and acted towards collective desires. We need to think about how to unlearn the way of inserting our skills in order to ensure that people don't just become participant, service users of another kind, but can become true co-creators. This is about learning collectively how to take and share responsibility, to think and act beyond one's own immediate needs, assumptions and desires, and to be very conscious of when and where we are being privileged in relation to others. So the collaborators collectively embody the role of the artist and bring their skill set and methodologies to the tables where they are co-creators and co-teachers. In this, they take on the responsibility of holding the project. At the beginning, these collaborators wanted to establish some rules of engagement, including collective values. And this was very, very difficult because we were all coming from different points of view with varying experiences and methodologies. And only as of Monday like 6 weeks ago, we were able to create our core values as a group of editors. We have 7 editors on the project. Like we started our first meeting with the editors before even meetings with the working groups, we were like, okay, let's have community agreements. And it took us 1.5 years to settle on them, and I will show them later. And for us, like, I think the way that this project has been evolving, that it's like we've really been trying to become a collective body. And in order to do that, we had to listen to one another, become frustrated, become uncomfortable, work at it again, and practice and training together. So those atmospheres, as they are, like I told you, reconstruction. And reconstruction engages with rewriting personal historical narratives and reimagining the built environment, addressing urgencies of mass incarceration and displacement. Sovereignty asks questions about self-determination, autonomy and forms of freedom through the exploration of urban agriculture and alternative economies. Future seeks to reclaim the past and the present in order to decolonize and liberate our collective futures, looking at indigenous rights, its environmental intersections and counter-narratives. And Sanctuary unpacks the complexity of seeking and making safe space across the city, including immigrations and refugees, LGBTQ spaces and harm reductions. And the movement atmosphere is dedicated to modes and methodologies of dissemination, including education, performance, mapping, and public access. Through movement, knowledge, skills, and narratives are assembled, distributed, and reenacted. These working groups are emerging collective working towards coalition building. These atmospheres present the potential collective of the city undercurrents, its emotional substrata. So I show you some images of some of the working groups, and I always said I don't like to show images of working groups because they all look the same. But they were sort of like very instrumental, these working groups, to unpack these very broad, like if you want, themes or atmospheres, and to actually think about where do we find them in the city? Where do people think that these acts of resilience and resistance are located? And how can we just not only amplify the work that's already being done and strengthen the work and bring like our collaborative strength to it. And like what was sort of interesting in this working group, that a lot of these people, like although they're all doing amazing work in the city, not necessarily were at the table before together. So it was also talking about these issues across different, like say, more thematics. So like people from different groups talking about sanctuary, groups that not necessarily always share the same value sets. And I think this idea of values became a very important things about like thinking about how to become a collective body. It's like what kind of values do you share and how can you share values in space, especially if they are really sometimes conflictual, some of these values, or are like maybe even biting each other in a very interesting way. Oh yeah, so I'll show you the values. Very simple if you once written them down. But so, and they're also not like values people can disagree on, but I think like these were the ones we were honestly with the 9 of us that we are as the core artistic team, that we were all thinking that we could sort of like hold ourselves to. And for us, transparency was building towards the collective process in relation to power, budget, and capacity. So that's a very important one. From the beginning, talking about being transparent about the budget and being transparent about how money is allocated and where it's allocated has been a very, very, very important one, but also a very difficult one. And also transparency about capacity. How much can you actually give to a project? And who can give what? And some people can give 2 hours and need to be compensated 2 hours. Other people are compensated 2 hours but give freely 5 hours, stuff like that. So this balance about who gives and who can give, and how to value that, and how to be honest about each other and not frustrated about, like, I didn't see you last time. You know, like, or not even be judgmental about that. And also transparency in relation to power, because this whole project from the beginning was in relationship with the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And for a lot of the community groups and the people we're working on, the Philadelphia Museum of Art is this citadel on the hill, this like sort of like European colonial white bastion that now suddenly wants a relationship with the city. Like, what does that mean? And like in its new like sort of program, it talks about it wants to be a civic space. But like, why does it want that and can it hold that? And so like a lot of our collaborators from the very beginning in the working groups were like, nah, not buying that. Like, please rephrase, please again. But from the beginning, people were very interested in talking about, like say, this becoming a collective body, amplifying this acts of resilience and resistance in the city. So people were very keen of doing that, but also people were there quite often on their individual, were there as an individual, but also representing like larger bodies in the city. And also some of those people were core organizers. So like they were also like, why would we spend time talking about an exhibition or a project in relation with the Philadelphia Museum of Art while there is so much urgent work to do? And after the elections, of course, that became like really, that was in the midst of like our 1.5 year, that became completely like I would say a making or a breaking point, because there was other work to do. It would almost could feel like an act of vanity to sit around the table to keep discussing about what we could collectively ideate and what we could collectively imagine a collective future. Like, well, people needed to be on the streets, you know, like that. And I think what has been sort of interesting that all of those conversations were part of this 1.5 year of a journey. And like some people ask me, did you record all of that? No. So I hope it will transcend in whatever we are going to publish about it, but I think the struggles were important. Collaborative learning, participating in listening and speaking as an active practice. Something that, like, I think, like, going back to Maaike in the beginning said, like, this act of, like, intervention, but what is actually the act of listening or the act of speaking? Let's start there before we start intervening, let's say that. In which everybody has a voice, of course, but what is very much important for us is the willingness to engage in uncomfortable conversations. And I know that we all, like in our practice, like it's been for a while, like en vogue to talk about agonism and antagonism and about conflict, and that's very, very important. Most of these processes are conflictual, they're frictious, but I think what at the core of that is also to look at yourself if you are also yourself are willing to engage in an uncomfortable situation, and to create spaces in which it can be possible to engage in an uncomfortable conversation without necessarily bringing things to a breaking point. And radical inclusivity, which was unpacking layers of oppression and privilege by othering differences and commonality. And also that one is a very, very difficult one. And thinking back about, like, my public faculties, like when I practice is that having conversations with people that I not necessarily share my point of view or my political stances. So if you really want to be radical inclusive, it means a lot of work on yourself and your own, like, say, pre-assumptions and ways that you are in the world. So letting go of one's own subjectivity in order to extend space for others is beautiful to say, but in principle a very, very difficult act to do and to practice. And I said before, I think we are not very good at that. We're not very good at not being linear in time and targeted with projects. We are not very good in allowing space for things to emerge or for things to go completely a different direction, you know. So in that sense, we are all very ingrained in a neoliberal moment of wanting to achieve something, even if it's the common good, you know. So some of our house style, some of the way we think about audiences. It's interesting what kind of diagrams you need. The website, I ask people to go and have a look at the website if you want to see where we're at the moment. So recently, each of the working groups came up with their 2 sites across the city. And this has been a moment of transition in the project, when people went from defining to actually projecting. When people go from defining to actually projecting what they want to see in the city. And at this moment, working group members were also looking to their own affiliations and acts of organizing and locating these throughout the city. In this sense, they were each starting to reimagine their own local condition. We look carefully at how these processes of building collective agency work on the scale of the local, and then from there think about how we can weave or net them together, creating a web of smaller local entity that's strong enough to resist the current condition. And that is sort of important, that when we were in the working groups talking about these atmospheres, we had a lot of, like, you know, uncomfortable conversations. Think about sovereignty and just talking about freedom or the concept of freedom. Like, it's very hard to agree on that. Like, so most working groups just immediately say there's no one definition of, you know, like that was sort of like, but that's also too easy. So, like, to try to figure out, at least come like up with a description. And I think sort of sanctuary, that sort of points at, okay, like, let's call ourselves towards sanctuary. Like the fact that we are on a learning curve towards an understanding of what sanctuary can be. And they came up finally with, like, a program of what they call the Sanctuary Stewardship Program, in which from each of the individuals in the group and all of the associated organizations, they went to each other to learn from each other the different ways in which people daily deal with stewarding sanctuaryship, to come up with a curriculum that people could learn from each other a different way. So how would you hold immigrant rights while at the same time be able to hold a safe space for LGBTQ? They're not always in the same sphere. So about the local, because I know that has been coming up. So and like, what does make somebody a local, or when are you inside or outside or a community? So I believe, and that's very important, that the local is the scale where we might be able to understand new social, political and economic relationships. The local is an open public arena where you meet the other, smell the other, taste the other, where you're able to confront the other through active engagement. It's a space in which you perform yourself and your understanding of the world, a field of tension in which people actively exercise what it means to live together. In this way, I see the local not as a specific place, but as a condition that site-specifically embodies global conflicts and conversations. I believe that these small local forms of resistance could be practiced everywhere, and at the moment when it's needed, they should also function as a netted system, collectively sharing knowledge and skill sets. So I always speak about that. I do believe about something what I call experts on location, like especially when people sometimes say like, but are you from the community? Like that's a very difficult question, because quite often like who is the community and who determines who the community is, and especially in territories where we speak they're very fractured, or where communities are displaced, or where like there is not a sense of community or a sense of like belonging that is collectively shared, then I think it is important to think about that people have knowledge of that site. And that can be somebody who lives there, who has a profound knowledge of what it means to live there. But it can also be a shopkeeper that maybe not live there, but that operates a shop there. Or maybe the bus driver that has that route through that neighborhood for so many years and knows the people on that route. So, or somebody who has profound knowledge what it means to live in an area that is a food desert and has experience with that. So I believe that this local is a condition, and that we all have bits of that knowledge of that condition, that we all have bits of that knowledge, and it is important to understand how the bit of knowledge that you carry can be a skill set that can be offered in a certain situation. But I do also believe that time is important. So like I'm in my third year living in Philadelphia for that reason. So.
Would you consider yourself local?
Huh?
Would you consider yourself local yet?
No. Yeah, or not in that sense. Like I do think I by now have I have like definitely some knowledge of Philadelphia. Like, but that's also because I've been actively working with it. So my experiences are through like work in this case, through working with the city and with people in the city. And I have experience of living there now, but like my experience of like working in the city is larger than my experience of living in the city. Does that make sense? So it's also the lens of which you are local that sometimes can shift. And I think that's also, we should not like, forget about that. So like, I think that was what sort of the project has been mainly asking, like, what are the acts of resistance and resilience in our living environment? The process of strengthening and building the net happens through repetitive durational engagement. And I find that very important to say that, because if people talk about durational projects, and time is very important in durational project, but time and duration doesn't mean how long can you stick around, because I think that's also a misconception. So I also believe about repetitive insertions, so that it's more often in how often you actually really engage with the territory that matters for the duration, and the fact that you take time, that you wait, that you take time again, that you like put heat, that there is a way of engaging much more than that you just stick it out, you know, like just hanging around doesn't mean anything in this kind of thing. So time is in that sense like non-linear, but it's also repetitive. It's about repetitive engagements. So in this sense, a project, at some point when it starts running, it becomes its own organizational form, with its own sense of time, flow, and nodes. Some of them antagonistic, some of them hopeful. The organization, as we call it now, Philadelphia Assembled, is made up of over 150 collaborators who are unlearning and training for the not yet, along myself. And what you saw is that the first meetings, there was a lot of like enthusiasm of people sharing information about themselves. But when it comes to the moment when it becomes clear that you have to start building together, like the shit hits the fan, I always say. Because then that is like sort of like the moment where the process becomes really like sort of like difficult, because then you have to sort of like find out that you have to start building together, and you discover that you must scrutinize oneself to keep working across education level, class, gender, race and religious and political stances. And that needs a slow learning and cumulative change through an open, conflictuous, durational and inclusive process. A steep learning curve full of political uncertainties for all involved. And I think that is something that I find also important to say, that this scrutinizing yourself to keep working with people and building together, so that from ideating to building is actually a process that's full of political uncertainties, because you have to sort of like confess what is actually most important for you, or why you are there and what you want to achieve, and and how that is upheld in the mix. So.
When you say you there, do you mean you as the artist originator, or do you mean you as the members of your collective?
I mean you as in we, as in you. As in you and me, and in the process as we, but I also like to see you, I always like to say you, and sometimes I say me, but we have to, you have to yourself also take that responsibility.
Regarding like collaborators and the photos you showed us of those large working groups, how do you drive decision making within those large groups, and how does consensus work in that situation, or does it work at all?
Like I always say, consensus and a creative process are not each other's best friends. I'm very honest and open about that. So, I think, for instance, some things have been done very deliberately. Let's say, saying, okay, I am not the one who's holding this conversation. I invite a group of 8 people, and in this case, predominantly women, to co-hold with me the space and hold the discussion. And each of them is leading a working group. And each of them is also deciding on how they structure their working group. So some of the working groups are very consensus-driven. Other works are much more like people bringing different ideas, and there are different processes of the way in which that works, which makes the projects really complex. And like I said, I speak to you very open now because I'm in the midst of it. It makes it very complex because there's not one pre-inscribed process about how this should go. So so all the working groups also didn't use the same methods or the same methodologies to get to a certain point, or choose a certain way to get to it. For instance, in reconstructions, they, besides talking and introducing each other about the different work they were doing in the city, they did a series of teach-ins. They asked people from outside to come and do a series of teach-ins about certain certain parts of the topics that came up to collectively gain knowledge. So there was a teaching around the Reconstruction era given. There was a visit to the Let's We Forget Slavery and Holocaust Museum. There were different ways in which they collectively builded knowledge. Other working groups went from a more consensus-based thing. Okay, what is our atmosphere? How can we get to a certain point? So there was no pre-inscribed method. I don't know if I'm going to get killed for that, but I think I wouldn't say consensus is overrated, but I think. We have to be also very, very aware of the frameworks of organizing that we are operating, and we should be also very carefully in or let's say we should, I should, scrutinize our own ways of believing what the right way of organizing is, or the right way of bringing people into the space. And that is also in the collective learning and in the collective unlearning, but it's predominantly in the practicing that together, you know, on the journey, and figuring out what for a group will work best, you know, so. So we are at the moment in the city. And people choose different ways of ideating and talking about it. This is the ground floor of an affordable house on 4th and Master in a community garden, in which we hold a lot of conversations around gentrification and displacement, and about the master narratives, as they are called, about whose story is told, what narrative is called, what master narrative is called. Sanctuary decided to create a portable dome, which turned out to be very colorful and lovely, which is built by Traction Company and designed by Mayada Al-Hamzi, that traveled from each organization to work as a kind of time capsule in which people could take time out to just talk about Sanctuary. So it works as a little workshop space and a hub, to end up in a larger one that has been 3 weeks in city center, in which all the stewards that have been training the stewardess program, been collectively trying to hold that space for 3 weeks and trying to practice towards Sanctuary, from a future vehicle to a reading in the Paul Robson house of Paul Robson's case in front of the Committee of Un-American Activities. Don't know if people know who Paul Robson is, but Paul Robson was an actor and a musician and I think football player, or at least a sportsman, who at some point was asked to defend himself for the Committee of Un-American Activities, and his plea is very, very interesting. So we were reenacting that plea, because it echoes a lot of what's happening at the moment about culture. To working with the African American Art Forum around economic sovereignty, and thinking about what does sovereignty means and economic sovereignty means, from cooperative models to thinking towards skill-based activities and self-produced activities. And they created a larger marketplace called the Seeds of Sovereignty. As another part of sovereignty is thinking about land and issues of land and land liberation and urban ecology, predominantly with urban creators and soul generation in North Philly. And a very beautiful staged picture that I just wanted to end with. So these are all the things that have been happening, in which people have been collectively trying to emphasize things, build things, move things forward, and with the idea to move things back to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So we are almost closing the public phase, and we are bringing all these conversations, all these discussions, all these elements, all of the fights back to the museum, to reassemble at the museum all the different journeys all the different groups have made, in order to talk about Philadelphia at this moment in time. And I started there because what for me was very important when I started thinking about Philadelphia assembled and about the museum, is that one of the things the Philadelphia Museum of Art has, besides all the different collections they have, is they have period rooms, a lot of period rooms. And I always was fascinated by them, because they are alchemates of their time. They are falsifications of time, but brought together to sort of like tell a story of a certain period through its artifacts or through its cultural things. And I always wondered what would the contemporary period room of Philadelphia look like? Because I started my conversations in this living room, so what would be on the table? What would be on the wall? What would come through the radio? What would be on the television? Which books would be there? What conversations would be held? But also more strongly, what would the table look like? Because very much in the beginning of the project says it's very nice to bring people around the table, but we also should question about what the table looks like. It's not only how you bring people to the table and make sure that they can be at the table through stipends and stuff like that, but even to question the table itself. And I think that has been very important for this project, to think about how can we tell a momentary story of Philadelphia through the lens of all these different participants. Through a process of deep listening, disagreement, speculation, and negotiation, Philadelphia Assemble seeks to reveal commonalities between unconnected individuals and unanticipated networks of solidarity in order to foster growing communities of resistance. And I used his opening quote in the beginning. Max Haven, who is a Canadian art historian, says, "Neoliberal capitalism has a dramatic and powerful influence on our imagination regarding who and what is valuable. It depends on transforming each of us into agents of neoliberal competition, individualism, and fear. Challenging this system will take more than just economic and political policies or movements. We will also need to transform culture and the imagination. The imagination, from the very beginning, is in motion, is embodied, is a collective exercise of care." And I like that very much, because he says that if we think about reimagining who and what is valuable, and to think about different ways of capitals, I think is that we not only need to transform the economies or even political policies or ways of organizing, but we also at the core have to sort of start transforming imagination and thinking of the way that we can collectively imagine our futures, to think about them as collective exercises of care. And I just want to say this again, that was crucial to this process of finding a common ground with another person is being able to let go of some of one's subjectivity, to put one's subjectivity at risk, or to temporarily extend one's subjectivity in order to approach other kinds of agency and look at the space that's in between. And as I mentioned above, the organizational form needs to begin in the city, as the city is fragmented and far from homogeneous. These publics from the extended field of the city are built with our working groups as peer-to-peer network. It is incredibly important to stress that there are collaborators from the museum as well, as the institution has to take part in the risking and the unlearning too. This means that it has to be willing to rethink its structure at its core. And that means for them, so museum staff members are an integral part to this project as both representatives of the museum and residents of Philadelphia. They are part of the imagining how their institution can become more porous and foster a different relationship with the changing city. This is not a project to develop audience engagement, but is a project to bring together various publics to build a coalition to re-examine the values that are embedded in an arts institution and how to make that radically inclusive. This can only be made possible to true willingness to engage and to work at it from both sides. And as some of the questions were about institutions as well, and I'm really rounding up now, the type of cozying up to a collaboration with each other and even institutions needs to be in constant practice if it has to become a reality. And this, I mean, it's not only art institutions, but that's institutions of any size. This idea of cozying up to an institution or even to one another in working together. And I would like to sort of quote Turkish artist Zeno Pekunulu. She said, even though the unexpected can happen, aka it's not planned, that does not mean we are not prepared. In the moment leading up to which you don't know, you practice on a small scale. practice for a possible change that everybody may feel but cannot yet articulate. And I like to turn that finding into a question. How do we train ourselves in our daily actions for a future change without the knowledge of what that change will look like, and without having to set targets to work towards within a sense of purpose? It's essential to realize that it is more about training than participating. What you learn together, you also need to put to test in public. Training for the not yet is a relational, dialogical, discursive process and a frictional process as well. It's a field of tension where together we work and rework the territory in order to ask how we can collectively live. It's a shared attitude that has to be repetitively practiced and performed together. And what I know and what I learned over the last 25 years is that it needs a continuous practice. Learning, making mistakes, testing again, retaking, trying again, and work at it again and again in order to create a place that allows us to perform our ideas, to negotiate hope, and to collectively imagine a future and build forms of solidarity. And I think it's important to see that as a practice. It's not something that can be, like I said before, put in a linear timeline or not. It's something that is a constant training for that what we not yet know, and learning how to practice for that not known, and also allowing ourselves to withhold the desire to be successful at it. With not necessarily menacing like, oh, let's fail, failing, it's so good to fail. But it's like because there are also groups of people you cannot fail, I always say, or failing is not always a desirable outcome either, but withholding and failing are not the same thing. So it's extending time, and to make time like non-linear, non-productive, non-accumulative, to think about different surplus values. And to finish, because I think like the Max Haven quote about like imagination as a collective exercise of care, I think is a very important one. And one other way of thinking about imagination and why it is such an important value to also alternative value that we should sort of like start celebrating more is a quote from, and I'm just going to show you, because it's a hard one for me to read, is one from Valida, from Octavia's Brood. The decolonization of the imagination is the most dangerous and subversive form there is, for it's where all forms of decolonization are born. Once the imagination is unshackled, liberation is limitless. So I urge you to keep imagining possible futures.